accredited comic book expert, aficionado, person that everybody goes to for the comic book knowledge. So.
I felt so like embarrassed when you were telling me. I felt really, so this is actually Kevin's panel, and then he asked me if I would like to be on it. So I actually felt very, I guess, honored and humbled that Kevin asked, because he's also really good friends with people at the Japan Film Society, which I met last week, and the gentleman who leads it, Peter, he spoke very highly of you. So I felt like, oh no, Kevin is asking me, but yes, I was the Will Eisner Comic Industry Judge, which is basically the Academy Awards for comic books, and I was the judge last year for 2022. And actually some of the, which is the highest honor you can get, is either to be a comics judge or to be nominated and win in one of those categories. And actually, Kevin was very astute and detailed. Some of the comics that he actually picked today were Eisner nominated last year, the year that I had did it. No influence. I don't want people filming and being like, she influenced them. But you picked really, really good ones. So thank you for asking me to be a part of it.
Absolutely. So yeah, and for those that don't know me, I'm Kevin Derendorf. I run the Mason Patrol blog and have written a book called Kaiju for Hipsters, which is 101 alternative giant monster movies. But we're not talking about movies here today at all. We're talking about comic books. And comics are another thing that is, near and dear to my heart. And if you've seen my panels in the past, you know that we usually have way too much content for the amount of time that we have. So unfortunately, we had to make some tough cuts in terms of the titles that we're talking about today. So first, there's a lot of Godzilla comics. There's a lot of Godzilla comics. You could have an entire panel on Godzilla comics. I think you have a panel on Godzilla comics tomorrow, right?
I do. So IDW's Godzilla writers Eric Burnham and Dan Groening will be here at 10 a.m. tomorrow. They are one's zooming in, Dan is zooming in from Canada, and Eric actually flew in just for this panel tomorrow at 10 a.m. and then he's going to leave immediately afterwards. And he has free giveaways for everyone. But yes, he is they're the creative team pair for IDW's Godzilla series that is family friendly. So he will actually be here tomorrow at 10 a.m.
Yeah, so basically this is a topic for another time. So we're going to have to skip over Godzilla comics. Similarly, I've given multiple panels on Kaiju manga in the past, so I think we don't need to talk about those today. We can revisit them at some future date. And while we're at it, let's not talk about King Kong comics, because there's so many King Kong comics out there. And there's a lot of Ultraman comics, so let's not talk about Ultraman. Let's just not talk about any of the big brand name comics. We're not here to discuss big brands. Let's talk about Marvel. So Marvel, originally founded in 1939, as Timely Comics, and keep me honest, because you know this better than I do. They're kind of the big power player in the American comics industry. I think they're kind of the best known. I don't think they have technically the most titles right now, but I think they are kind of the one with the most cultural staying power at the moment. They are the Spider-Man, the Avengers, the X-Men company, and they have a whole lot of history with monsters. So going back to the 1950s, kind of before they got really heavily into the whole superhero thing, they had a whole big variety of titles that they did. They did romances and westerns and all sorts of different types of comic books, and one of their big genres was giant monster comics. And this really kind of saturated a lot of their output, basically up until around the time when the superheroes took over. A lot of you had these anthologies like Tales to Astonish or Journey into Mystery that had these giant monster stories, and then they kind of like pivoted into being superheroes as that became more prominent. And then there's kind of some cultural reasons for that. They were trying to get away from horror stuff, as there was a new comic book code that was trying to But honestly, a lot of these giant monster comics weren't really too problematic in terms of their content at the time. You have any thoughts about any of those?
Well, he was talking about the Comics Code Authority that kind of came after Dr. Wortham's. He believed, he wrote a book that was, to this day, I think, still reverberates through our society about how children are horrible and delinquents and they became gangsters because of comics that they read, when in reality, if they're reading comics at home at night or after school, they're not going out becoming hoodlums. So it's like blaming video games on everything. And because of that, he believed things like horror, gore, fighting too many villains, or any will warp the way children kind of thought. So what Kevin was talking about was correct, is they had to tone down on certain things, because the Comics Code Authority came and said, we don't want extreme horror or anything because it's going to influence our children, which is not true.
So some of the characters that you see introduced in that whole age of giant monsters are still with Marvel today, because Marvel has been kind of one pervasive universe as it's gone along. So now you get these big blockbuster movies that incorporate characters like Groot is in the Guardians of the Galaxy franchise has become very popular thanks to Vin Diesel. But started off as this big menacing alien monster, and similarly Fin Fang Foom, I think, is probably the most famous comic book giant monster. Got started as one of these rampaging beasts. And there's kind of surprising connections across some of these. You'll notice the Full Moon Entertainment direct-to-video monster movies from the 90s had names like Zarkor the Invader and Kra the Sea Monster, and that's because the people who were working at Full Moon were big fans of old Marvel books, and they would just go through and look for the names of strange creatures that were in the Marvel things and just, yoink, let's reuse this. And they basically, as we mentioned in the 60s, the number of giant monster things fell off, but they never completely stopped. There were always stories, even when they started dealing much more with the superhero stuff, that the superheroes would fight giant monsters on regular occasions. But every once in a while, you get cases where they kind of lean back into their kaiju roots. In the 70s, Japan started getting Marvel comics, starting in 1970 with the Ryoichi Ikegami Spider-Man manga. Japan is a huge comic book country, but they didn't really have a whole lot of American comics coming over, so they started adapting them for consumption in completely Japanese-based context. So you get, Kazuo Koike made a Hulk manga, or there's a Moon Knight manga, etc., etc. And part of that whole crossover was you got Spider-Man as a superhero who had a giant robot, which actually, if you look into the history of things, was where Power Rangers gets its giant robots from. Meanwhile, on the American front, Marvel was taking all of these Japanese properties and adapting them. So that's where you get, I think for people here, they're going to know mostly the Shogun Warriors and the Godzilla King of Monsters, but Marvel was key in the creation of Transformers as a franchise, and they also had a Zoids comic that. So basically, they were taking a whole lot of Japanese toys and saying, "Hey, let's make up stories for these," and making Western-based comics off of them. Fun fact: this actually includes Ultraman, but not as you'd expect. There's a toy line in the 70s called Godzilla's Gang, where it was a Godzilla figure and multiple Ultraman toys. And Marvel had the license to Godzilla's Gang, so they didn't have the license to Ultraman, but they had the license to Ultraman's monsters. And as a result, some of these Ultraman monsters, like Nicholas and Anwar here, wind up in different Marvel books. And again, we mentioned Marvel is a consistent universe, so even though they lose the rights to these things, the ramifications of the storylines that are in those books, the stuff that happens in Shogun Warriors or in Godzilla, continues to exist in the Marvel universe, even if they can't legally name drop the things that are happening. It's kind of a funny thing. And you see this with a lot of their stuff, like Rom Space Knight, or Micronauts, or Doctor Who. They had their comics were set in the Marvel universe. The characters would be running into Marvel characters, and then stuff that happens in those books influences books that come down the line, even after Marvel no longer had those licenses. And that's where you get kind of this weird situation where they want to keep licensing, they want to keep referencing Godzilla, but they can't always reference Godzilla. So here's a famous example from Spider-Man comics in 1996, where this was like a story about toys, basically. And initially, Spider-Man was fighting a giant toy Godzilla that's very much based on the Trendmasters. And they, I think, got skittish and they went in and they edited the art so that it no longer resembles Godzilla, because for those that don't know, Toho can be litigious.
That storyline was influenced off of Toy Story.
Yes.
That came off that year, and then they had, that's why he's fighting toys, because he was shrunk down to a smaller size, and he was fighting toys, because it was based off of the idea that Toy Story came out that year, and it was a huge love for it.
Here's another more recent example. This is from 2007. This is a storyline where the Mole Man has a bunch of subterranean monsters that come out and fight the Avengers. And just in one of the panels, you get this suspiciously familiar looking face. And I think maybe somebody decided that it was too suspiciously familiar looking, because between when this was initially solicited and when the final issue came out, they removed those dorsal spines. But in the official handbook of the Marvel Universe, they write it very ambiguously so that you don't know if this is supposed to be Godzilla or not. But Marvel is still in the Japanese entertainment game, so we've got this currently coming out Ultraman comic, which is not in its own continuity because I think they learned their lesson there. But they are having their own crossover with Avengers, and I don't know if that's a multiverse thing. Multiverse has been very popular lately, or what. But then you also have, they had Attack on Titan crossover recently, which was set in some alternate continuity, and then the Spider-Verse comics have actually brought in Spider-Man's giant robot from the 70s. So they have been really a friend to some of this Japanese IP. And sometimes they've been, maybe not doing the best service to some of these IPs as well. They had the license to the Saban's Power Rangers, Master Rider, and VR Troopers in the 90s, and these comic books are terrible. they're really kind of chintzy, and I think they were cranked out, but they were part of that whole zeitgeist. For those that don't know, these are all things that are based on Japanese television shows that were brought to the U.S. and then refilmed with American actors. So that's the connection behind all of these. This is an interesting one. So, does everybody know about the Disney's Big Hero 6? Does everybody know that was originally a Marvel comic?
Yes.
So this is a weird one because it started as a Marvel comic, and Disney bought Marvel, and suddenly this one team that existed within Marvel became Disney's property, and it no longer appeared in Marvel anymore. But one of the main characters in Big Hero 6 is this robot Baymax, and when the team was first introduced, Baymax turns into this giant kaiju dragon thing, because Big Hero 6 is basically a pastiche of a lot of Japanese tropes of superhero. The leader of the team was a silver samurai and stuff like that. And as it went along, they kind of dialed back the kaiju stuff. First he was just a regular robot, and then the Disney movie came out, and suddenly he's this marshmallow.
He is. Because the series was a limited series by a group of writers called Man of Action. They also do a lot of Marvel animated series, and it's done by Duncan Rollo and Steven Seagal, and they did the comics that Kevin has up. So Big Hero 6 was a limited series, the team was slightly different. Like Hero is still there, but they had Silver Samurai from Marvel Comics. And then when it became Disney-fied, you still had Honey Lemon and Hero, and you still had Baymax, and you have Fred, who actually in the comics was like Fredzilla. And however, Fred is voiced by T.J. Miller, I believed, and he is a little bit different. There were a lot of people, and I think Kevin knows about this, is when a property is announced, people try to buy the original items, knowing that the value will go up. So a lot of people bought the original Big Hero 6 comics off of eBay, believing that the price would go up. But if you watch the film, it deviates very greatly from the comics. And so the value of the original comics didn't really inflate as a lot of people, a lot of collectors or people were hoping. Because like he said, this is such a massive change, including down to the team. So you pointed out a very good observation.
A little bit more kaiju-ish sort of thing. There's this Monsters Unleashed event, and this was in 2016 into 2017. And really what this was it was about, across the whole Marvel universe, it was a big event where different superhero teams were fighting a lot of the classic giant monsters that you saw in those comics from the 50s and 60s. But then they also introduced this new character whose superhero name is Kid Kaiju, and his whole power is that he can draw kaiju in his books, and then they come to life and help him. So this, he's had like a handful of appearances over the, since then, but a lot of cool people have worked on it. You can see the creative team here is this list of like 5 lines long, and a lot of those are great people, and some of them will come up later again in this very panel. Also, another Avengers character that has been memed quite a lot because he's ridiculous is just named American Kaiju, and his secret identity is Todd Ziller. So this is one that I think there's one particular frame from one of the comics where he's doing quotes like that gets circulated quite a lot online. But I think it's ridiculous, but I think it also demonstrates the level of saturation that we have 2 different superhero characters in Marvel running around that just have the word kaiju in their name now. I think that's a level of recognition that is kind of unprecedented. If you went back like 10 years ago, you would not have expected that.
Yeah. So Todd Ziller looks like that because he had part of the experiment was he volunteered to be injected with a bunch of things. And one of them, besides the pin particles, is the Connor serum, which is off of the lizard from Spider-Man, which is why he ends up looking like that, because people ask, where does the lizard exterior come from? And that's where it came from.
Yeah, well, like we said, Marvel stuff all like ties into other
Yes.
previous things.
Yes.
So we're gonna just go through a bunch of the different power player comics companies and talk about some of the titles that they have. So we talked about Marvel for a little bit. Another one that is, not as recognized today, partially because they were absorbed into DC Comics, is Charlton. And if that name rings a bell, that's because they put out the comics that were based on Gorgo and Reptilicus and Conga. But they actually had, long before that, they had one of their horror anthologies that had art by Steve Ditko called The Thing, which, if you try to Google The Thing plus comics, you will have a difficult time due to a Marvel thing. And if you try to Google The Thing plus giant monsters, there's a Godzilla movie that makes it difficult. So it can be a little bit of a challenge, but if you Google The Thing plus Steve Ditko, you can find these comics in their public domain. And not all of them are giant monsters, a lot of them are just general horror, but there's a giant monster story or two among them. This ran for 17 issues back in the 50s.
And also something that if you were to Google, like what Kevin said, you're going to see the word Blue Beetle pop up because Charleston then went into DC, and it said 17, but the numbering continued, and it became 17, 18, and then it became Blue Beetle with Dan Garrett. So it was an odd, when you try to look for more, you're like, why does a completely different character pop up?
Mm-hmm.
And that was one of the reasons why. And a new movie that's coming out from DC.
Yeah, speaking of Steve Ditko, I think a lot of people know that he worked on Gorgo and Konga, but he had some additional original characters that showed up in this Fantastic Beasts, Fantastic Giants special one-shot. So this was an anthology where it had a Konga story that was previously published and a Gorgo story that was previously published, and then Mountain Monster and Hogar. So if you happen to track this down, it's again public domain, so a lot of people have reprinted it, but you get kind of interesting, okay, so this is what he would come up with when it wasn't adapting a character from an existing movie. Although, in fairness, both Konga and Gorgo have a lot of original adventures and with a lot of original monsters that aren't part of those original movies.
Yeah, and Hogar is something that Kevin put up there. There's a story within it called Help with Hogar, and it's giant. It's a giant kaiju, and at the end, an alien spaceship comes, and it looks like the face of Ultraman. So it's very interesting, all the influences that you were talking about, and how some people, whether consciously or subconsciously, the artist just kind of draws that into it, which is really, really fascinating.
I think one more thing we got to talk about with Charlton, because this is ridiculous. So we were talking about the numbering continuing. So they did an adaptation of Reptilicus for 3 issues, and then they lost the rights to Reptilicus. So then the next month they had issue 4 of Reptisaurus, not to be confused with Reptilicus, even though it basically is just Reptilicus that's been with the numbering filed off. It's a very similar thing to what Marvel did with Godzilla's later appearances in Iron Man and stuff like that. This character was, I guess, enough of a pervasive thing that, again, because it's a public domain thing now, there was then a 2009 Reptisaurus movie. So it's this weird, okay, this was a movie that got adapted into a comic book that got mutated into a different comic book that then got made into a movie.
They felt that the comic was really sad because he ends up falling in love with a giant mechanical dragon. And then when that dies, it becomes sad and it leaves. And so they were like, maybe we can rectify that, not people feel so bad, and make it into a film. But some people felt bad watching the film afterwards.
So now let's get to DC. I think they're the other well-known comic book company in America, and they're the Batman, Superman, Justice League, Harley Quinn people or whatever. They have a whole lot of the iconic superheroes, and usually those superheroes will fight against giant monsters, but you don't get as many stories about the giant monsters kind of on their own, like you did at Marvel. If you look at their stable, but they do have some that are kind of noteworthy. One thing I did want to bring up is there's a classic Batman story that got adapted into a manga in Japan, Jiro Kawada's Bat manga, I think it's called over here. And this is about some criminals that have a giant mechanical dinosaur that they're using to steal things that they steal. And everybody kind of thinks, okay, well, this is a dinosaur, but Batman is a detective, so he figures it out. And then a real dinosaur shows up to fight the mechanical one. And just as I was reading this, there's a scene where the one dinosaur tears off a piece of the side, and it reveals the mechanism underneath. And I just thought, this is very similar to what happens in Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla in 1974. So I don't have any sort of solid confirmation that this is something that the people working on Mechagodzilla were aware of. I just, my kind of conspiratorial tin hat thought is that's interesting.
And it comes full circle. In Batman the Animated Series with Kevin Conroy, there's an entire storyline with Hardak. And then Bruce Wayne's partial face skin falls off and you realize it's actually part of Hardak. And people are like, more than Terminator, many people were like, is this from Mechagodzilla? So it finishes full circle in that way.
This is one case where we do know that there was a direct influence, and this is Shigeru Mizuki's Jomon Shonen Yogi, where he just basically lifted the creature from DC Supergiant story. But Mizuki tended to do that. In fact, some of his early stories were just blatant Superman knockoffs. We were talking about how Mechagodzilla might have influenced Batman, and one of the great examples of this is this Batman Unlimited series. They have 3 direct-to-video movies, and then the last one is Mechs versus Mutants, where Killer Croc and Clayface and some of the other villains get injected with a serum that makes them turn giant into kaiju. So naturally, Batman is always prepared, so he has giant robots ready to go to fight them.
Yeah, you said it was a trilogy. It's Batman Unlimited, it's Animal Instincts, Monster Mayhem, and then Mechs and Mutants. I watched all 3 at once with my best friend, and afterwards he turned to me and he was like, you just tricked me to watch a kaiju film. It was a kaiju trilogy. He's not as interested, as invested as I am, but you were saying it basically it's that at the end.
Yeah, similarly, there's 2 other examples that aren't taken directly from the comics, but are DC properties. The first is the Max Fleischer Superman has a short called The Arctic Giant, which has a giant fire-breathing dinosaur rampaging through the city that Superman fights. And this is over a decade before Godzilla was a thing, but we know that those shorts did make their way to Japan, and it's unclear if there's any cross-contamination on that creative influence. And then the series Legends of Tomorrow is a time-traveling story. They had an episode where the heroes go back in time and they meet Ishiro Honda and have a sequence where he's on a miniature set and sees one of the heroes fighting a giant octopus, and it has this moment of inspiration. So those are all worth checking out to some extent or another, even though they're not technically comic books. It's adjacent enough, and all 3 are a lot of fun. This is one that it's honestly it's been a long time since I have read this story, but it's one of the examples that gets brought up as an example of the influence of kaiju stuff on comic books. Is the 2nd issue of Planetary has the team basically going to the Monster Island and finding remains of a kaiju that has passed away. I don't know if you have anything to add about this one.
It's about, Planetary is just Wildstorm is an imprint off of DC, and it's a group of, they're archaeologists for the impossible, and it was kind of a mad scientist that's very similar to a storyline of there's a nuclear bombing. They love to use the word zero, so later on we'll see like a Commander Zero, we have, Monster Zero. This was called Island Zero, and there was a lot of old, they thought had long passed giant monsters off of. You're seeing a lot of similarities, and they went to go investigate the Planetary, this group of archaeologists for the impossible, and they believed that everything on there was gone, but instead they're actually still alive, like on the cover that it gives. And I just find it really interesting that there's so many parallels to storylines that we know, and the word zero always keeps not just popping up here, but in other things that Kevin is also going to pull up.
Yeah, we'll get to some of those other zeros in a little bit. Giant Killer, this is one of my favorites. It's basically Hellboy, but it's great in terms of it's a story about there's kaiju that are rampaging in the world, and this government organization has this basically boy that they've raised to be part human, part kaiju, and go off and fight against this kind of kaiju family, so to speak. This was originally run by DC, but it's been since moved over to Image Comics for the reprints. There was recently a Kickstarter for a painted artwork, and it's just absolutely gorgeous.
The characters are Jack and Jill, Giant Killer, and the king of the monsters, actual term used, is Roar, with 2 R's in the beginning, not at the end. So again, I felt that was very on the nose, but still sort of an original idea that just takes a lot of influence from other properties.
And not to be confused with Giant Killer, which is a different comic from IDW. Again, careful with them. Now let's get to Dark Horse. A lot of people are going to know them for their Godzilla and Gamera comics, but you know they are the people that put out Hellboy and Goon and Umbrella Academy. Those are things that you might know from pop culture. So I think the representative kaiju work for them is the big guy and Rusty the Boy Robot. And this actually is a very short comic. It only ran for 2 issues, but it just has very meticulous, very detailed artwork by Jeff Darrow, and it's written by Frank Miller, who is a giant in the industry as well. This is basically about, you know, a little Astro Boy type of robot boy who befriends what he thinks is another robot, but it's actually just a piloted, like, giant mech suit with a human pilot inside of it. The studio Adelaide that made Godzilla the series, they actually made a Saturday morning cartoon out of this, and it's also fantastic. Would recommend checking it out.
Frank Miller is also known for Sin City, and in Sin City, Hell and Back, Big Guy also appears.
Oh,
yeah.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, so he puts in what he loves.
So we were talking about Zeros. This is one where I'm a big fan of the comics greatest world whole thing from Dark Horse. It was basically their attempt to create a shared superhero universe, and I think the only thing that people really remember is Barbed Wire because there was a Pamela Anderson movie. But one of those superheroes was basically an Ultraman pastiche, and this guy Hero Zero. He was kind of a little bit like Blue Beetle, but mostly like Ultraman. The idea is that there's a teenage boy that gets power from an alien, and then he can grow large and fight monsters. Did not have a huge run of comic books, but is well known for having fought Godzilla in the Dark Horse books. And a lot of people just assume because they only read the Godzilla books that, oh, this is a character created for Godzilla, and no, it was actually one of their Dark Horse superheroes that just happened to get his butt kicked by Godzilla and stop being a superhero after that. But that's not, believe it or not, the only Dark Horse Ultraman pastiche named Zero. An ongoing series right now, Jenny Zero. This is about basically a girl who her father was like the equivalent of Ultraman in this universe. So she kind of grew up being a spoiled, like, socialite, kind of a screw up, has lots of bad decisions in her life, but then she has to step up and become the hero in order to take on new monsters and new threats that have appeared in her universe. And there's a lot of kind of intrigue with the different characters that go on in it. And there's been 2 trade paperbacks so far, but this is one I would recommend checking out.
Yeah, her father is Commander Zero, like the great superhero kaiju fighter, and several great, comic artists has reviewed it, Jenny's like a hot mess, and she's kind of a mix between Paris Hilton meets Commando, where she finally needs to kind of get out of that partying lifestyle and live up for her dad's name. And her best friend is a publicist and also a hotel heiress named Dana. So it's interesting watching the dynamic between these 2 women be hot messes and try to live up to her father's name after he passed.
It's a little bit like the Will Smith movie Hancock also. Another Dark Horse comic from a while back, this is Gigantic, and this is one that the story is something along the lines of, it's this giant creature sent to Earth for an basically an alien reality show. It's kind of like, it was billed as being like the Truman Show sort of scenario. So this is one that I read and don't remember terribly well, frankly, but...
The main character finds out he's basically in the Truman Show, but he's fighting kaijus, and it actually, the climax, it culminates to the end where he finds out it's two rival networks trying to get enough ratings watching him. It's so, what a metaphor of life. And so he's fighting the actual literal monster, and he's fighting this figurative ratings between two networks that want the best show that he could give.
This is a weird one because it was originally a webcomic that was kind of first created by a Kickstarter campaign, and then eventually Dark Horse kind of picked it up. And this is a Kill All Monsters, and I think that where this there's a couple of things that are interesting about it. One of it is, because it's a webcomic, it's a weird aspect ratio. It's all black and white, but this is, you see a lot of kind of Pacific Rim-y stuff that came out after Pacific Rim, but this predates Pacific Rim by a few years in terms of, stories about the giant monster apocalypse and the people piloting the robots to battle against them. And I wonder if anybody working on Pacific Rim was aware of this comic while they were making it.
He points out unusual print size and ratio. Like he said, it used to be a webcomic, then it was printed into an omnibus for 2017. So when if you were able to purchase and to get one of them, it's shaped more, I would say, like a laptop shape. So when you actually open it, cover to cover, it looks like a diorama. You see buildings, and then you see the monster. So when you open, the entire thing is a wraparound, and it becomes like an image of two kaijus destroying through a city. So instead of it's more horizontal than it is vertical when you read it.
This is a much more recent series. I think the second trade paperback just came out, Giants, and this is set in kind of a post-apocalyptic world where the kaiju are running rampant, and people are all just kind of struggling to survive, like little street urchins among them. And your main characters are brothers, basically. One goes down a very dark path, trying to survive in this world, and the other is the hero, and it's kind of the struggle between them. And interestingly, the duo behind this are in fact brothers. So and they're from somewhere in South America, right?
Yeah, and it's basically two orphans that get separated, and like a beautiful K-drama, there's a time jump 1 to 2 years later. And you see that they've been raised by different kaiju groups, so they come together. So is it friendship first, or is it being enemies is more important?
Gamma, this is one that kind of like it hurts a little bit because this was it was planned for 4 issues, and then only the first one ever got released. But it was just this giant pastiche of a whole bunch of different kind of tropes. You have like magical girls and transforming superheroes and monsters and kaiju and things like that. But I don't know exactly what happened to it, but it's unfortunate that we didn't get past that first issue.
It's Pokemon meets Power Rangers. So there's a guy named Dusty who is a failure his whole life, but he decides that he's going to go into training and kaijus and getting them. So like Pokemon, but they do it in suits, and the guards of them in suits that are very similar to Power Ranger suits. So it was gorgeous art. It was very, I'm going to say cute, but it had a lot. It could be for the whole family, but like you said, it was one issue, and then the rest just never came out.
So we'll pivot here to Image Comics. They're one that another kind of power player now. That their whole deal is that they have independent studios that kind of work as a confederation. So they've worked on a whole bunch of titles that you kind of know if you're in the scene. Like The Walking Dead, I think, is the one that is most well known. But Spawn, Witchblade, Invincible, Savage Dragon have all had adaptations into things. And for a while, Image was really pushing their own shared universe, and one of the characters in that was this guy, Fire Breather. And the idea behind this comic is that your main character is like the son of the huge over Kaiju king, Dragon Lord, but he's also half human, so he's kind of torn between worlds there, and has to go up against, again, his Kaiju family. So this character had his own series, but also showed up in this team up with the Pact, with Invincible and Shadowhawk and Zephyr, and had a Cartoon Network movie made from Aeon Flux's Peter Chung in 2010, which you can track down on DVD now, and it's a fun read. More recent comic, which was launched to much acclaim and a whole lot of publicity, was Ultra Mega, and this is from the Skybound imprint, which is Robert Kirkman's kind of like edgy comics, like Walking Dead or Invincible. Those are part of that imprint. So this is, you can tell just from looking at it, this is the edgy Ultraman. And it's very conspicuous that this comic came out in 2021. In 2020, Marvel had their Ultraman comic that was starting, and they're, draw conclusions from that as you will. But there was a huge push behind Ultra Mega when it was first coming out. That Dark Horse Image was putting out the books themselves, but also putting Ultra Mega stories as backups in other like anthology books and things like that. So it seemed like it was really like the rising star, and then after 4 issues, we kind of haven't heard anything, but allegedly it's continuing at some point. So.
Dave Stewart, the colorist on there, because it's the first thing that's going to capture you in the eyes. He's an Eisner winner for coloring as a colorist. And that was actually nominated for an Eisner the year I was the judge. So, I don't know. Take with that what you will.
Another kind of like lost story was Leviathan, and this is basically kind of rampaging monsters in a world story from John Layman, who wrote the Gangsters and Goliaths Godzilla story. And it only had 3 issues released, and it was never completed. And I guess that's because the artist named Pitara left Image for Vertigo for some period, and it just kind of derailed the creative process behind it. I've read the 3 issues, and honestly, like, I love a lot of Layman's stuff. I love Chew, for example, but Leviathan was not something that really clicked with me. Another one that comes up quite a bit, Big Girls. This is set in a world where some men will grow up to become kaiju, and some women will grow up to become giantesses, and the government basically uses the giantesses to fight against the kaiju. That sounds really goofy, and to some extent it is, but it's actually also kind of a touching story when it comes down to it.
Yeah, for those who read Ultra Mega and they prefer their female characters written a little bit differently, I would say, Big Girls would be a good one. Like you said, it was something that had happened, called The Mistake. And it affects both genders, but the boys will grow up eventually to become kaijus and monsters, but the girls will just get taller and bigger, and eventually that's how it is. And all of the groups coming together, the preserves, they are all a group of women, and the lead is Ember, like a 300-foot tall woman who loves everything in life, but she's just large and huge.
Johnny Monster, that's another Image comic that was part of their kind of shared hero universe. I actually have not read this one, but I know that Fire Breather shows up in it, so I thought it was worth mentioning. That it's apparently about a guy that fights different giant monsters.
What I've always find fascinating, I've always preferred the kaijus versus people. I'm always on the side of the kaijus. For this one, instead of taking them out, he's actually secretly I wouldn't say collecting them, putting them underground in a safe facility where he raises them because he was raised by a kaiju. So in all exterior purposes, everybody thinks he's out there taking them out in the negative sense. But he's actually making sure that they're loved and protected underground and like nobody else really quite knows.
Enormous is right what it says on the front because these comics are like yay big. They're very oversized, hard to fit in the shelf. Another kind of monster apocalypse kind of story. This was announced as in development for a TV series adaptation, but there's been no further follow-up on that, so I don't know what the situation is on that one. We'll kind of gloss over some of these because we've got some good titles and we have like 10 minutes left, I think, so we've got to hurry on. This was a Godzilla 98 kind of parody tie-in thing. The Giant Kaiju is a recent Image comic it's from the Deadpool authors, and basically it's a lot of toilet humor in your kaiju stuff.
I would say because there are children in the audience, the subject matter is the kaiju has adult needs. And so I would recommend not to let your children read.
Would not recommend that. Boom Studios, Steve Niles has a 2-issue series called Giant Monster. It's basically the Jamila storyline from Ultraman, where an astronaut gets turned into a giant rampaging monster and then fights a giant Nazi robot because of reasons.
It's also very gory and very horror because it's Steve Niles. So again, you want to let your children read this, I highly recommend you read it first and see.
Met Cadet U, it's really more of a giant robot story, but this just got, I think just this week, a trailer dropped for a Netflix adaptation, so I thought that was worth bringing up as one of those comics that's out there. And now there's a new comic series that's more based on the Netflix version. Let's get to Oni Press. Yeah, Kaiju Max is the best. This is basically, you know how Monsterland is like a jail for monsters in Godzilla, and Ultraman are kind of cops that police monsters. This basically takes this to the next level. This is a prison show, like Oz or Orange is the New Black or something like that, set on Monster Island where all the inmates are the monsters and the wardens are the Ultramen, and it is absolutely delightful. It's all of the tropes that are terrible things that you see in prison shows you can expect from it, but it's all filtered through, like, you know, they're not trading drugs with each other, they're trading like radioactive barrels of plutonium with each other, or things like that. Or you have your prison factions where they're like the cryptids versus the mutates or something like that. And it's this one ran for 36 issues, so I think it's the longest thing that we're covering today. But it is absolutely delightful, and it's chock full of so many references to Ultraman and Godzilla and all sorts of Pokemon, all sorts of kaiju stuff that you would be familiar with. It's absolutely a delight.
Yeah, and Xander Cannon is often in a lot of artist alleys and small presses at different conventions. And he's just a lovely, nice, amazing human being, and he's just great. So say hi to him.
Terrible Lizard. This is basically about a girl who befriends a giant T-Rex. This came out before Moon Girl and Devil Dinosaur. This is from Cullen Bunn, who wrote The Sixth Gun and Godzilla Cataclysm. And my money, I think that this is a much better comic than Moon Girl and Devil Dinosaur. So.
This came out in April 2015, and Moon Girl Devil Dinosaur came out in November 2015. And I love them both, but the lead for this one is a girl named Jessica, and that's also my first name. So I feel a special bond, like watching my dreams come true.
And they battle a lot of different monsters in it, which I also like. Robots. This is from Jay Torres. This is like a series of 3 kids books, basically, graphic novels where it's very kind of cute, but giant robots fight kaiju, basically. Real quick, I think we are getting down to time. From Antarctic Press, Hiroshi Kamitani is in the dealer's room. I'm sure he's selling some of his stuff, and he has a book, Color Raptor, which is a kaiju and Native American characters interacting. This has a trade paperback hopefully coming soon, from what I understand. So that's not his only title from Antarctic Press. He also has Kaiju Cooking, which is coming out soon, which is a cookbook. Quick, another one, Ultrabot Go Go Go. This is kind of another kind of classic Gigantor, Astro Boy kind of pastiche. I haven't actually read this one, so I just included it. But Konnichiwa Kaiju-kun. This is another one that seems like it's highly regarded, but only had one issue. So it's kind of playing into a lot of the tropes of society where monsters are.
It's a J-pop girls group where they signed up and they thought they'd be J-pop, but they are, but they also have to deal with kaijus in the 1970s. It's great.
And then I have no explanation.
I think it's in the title.
Really quickly, we can go through a couple of other publishers before we clear out. Comixology is a digital comics platform. It's actually owned by Amazon now, but they have had a number of originals. So ones that I would recommend, Goliath Girls is about a group of girls that basically raise a kaiju together. It's very cute. And the Stone King is kind of a fantasy world kind of thing where somebody goes out on a mission and accidentally brings a kaiju back to their village and has to deal with the consequences from that. Anything to add on either of those?
No, you covered them great.
Okay, cool. Vault Comics has a couple. We Ride Titans is a fun one. It's basically a family drama about a family where one they're all mecha pilots, and one is kind of a black sheep outcast and comes back needing to get back in the saddle, so to speak, with the giant robot. Giga, I have not actually read, so I have no comment on it. And then Aftershock Comics. This one hurts a little bit because a lot of people, when I say I'm doing a Kaiju Comics panel, they talk about Kaiju Score and how good of a book that is. And Aftershock Comics, they filed for bankruptcy, and I don't know if we're getting more Kaiju Score. It was announced that this was going to be adapted into a movie, but the first 4 issues have been collected into a book. The second 4 issues were announced for a book, and then the book hasn't ever come out. So we'll see what happens with it. But this is a heist story. Mm-hmm. This is like, imagine Ocean's 11 while Godzilla's rampaging in the background. Mm-hmm. So it's like, yeah, we'll use the cover of this kaiju rampage to make our score, and that's basically it. And it's a lot of fun. Top Shelf is another kind of small company, but they have a comic called Monster on the Hill, which is basically a bunch of villages, each have their own representative monster. And this got adapted very loosely into a movie called Rumble, which is about giant monster wrestling. American Gothic Press had their adaptation of Project Nemesis, which was, the original novels were Jeremy Robinson and Matt Frank working together. Same deal with the comic book. That had its whole run and was never collected into a trade paperback. They also had a spin-off with Island 731, which didn't finish its run, so I don't know what the situation is with that one either. But if you like the novels, you'll like the comics. That's basically the situation with that, because it's the same people. American Mythology has one called Cronin's Kaiju, written and drawn by Chris Scalf. If you have bought a lot of G fans, you know Chris Scalf, so it's just an original Kaiju story by him. Gosh, there's so many of these, aren't there?
There is. These were one of the comics submitted for Eisner consideration. Yeah. It's mega.
Yeah. So this is basically one with a small child who has to deal with a giant creature that's appeared and has some connection to their family kind of backstory. This is one you wanted me to add.
Oh, I just found it. So basically, it is kind of a parody spoof. He comes out, and it decides that what it wants more than anything is pizza. So it is good for all ages, and even adults can enjoy the type of humor, and you'll recognize a lot of influences.
All right, and on top of that, there's a million, gazillion, trillion independent comic books. A lot of them you can find in the dealer's room. So I would recommend going to the dealer's room, looking at some of the people who are selling their wares in there, and checking them out, because there's a lot of cool stuff, but we don't have time to cover everything, unfortunately, because kaiju are cool and people like making them.
Yeah.
All right, so on that note, thanks everybody for coming out today, and we'll see you later.